Hey everybody, great to have you back here in the fish tank. It's meta time again. We're going to go through the leaderboard data from this season of Minion Masters and have a look at what are the overall most played, strongest Masters, cards, decks, all that good stuff. Now, before we go into that, of course, there's a lot of time and effort goes into scraping all this information, putting it in, presenting it. So if you do enjoy this and you do want to support me, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're new here, and if you want to keep up to date, that is the best way to do it. Of course, also, if you enjoyed the video, thumbs up and leave a comment. Right, so we're going to be looking at version 2.9. So this season was the last season that new content is going to be added to Minions. So the last new card, the Revenant, and the last new perks, which is the new perk for Valorian and the new perk for Ravager. But let's see what changes that had. One thing to mention is that the leaderboards were broken for a while this season, so they weren't updating, so we weren't able to get any useful information from it. So a little bit less information overall in terms of number of decks that we've looked at. But we do what we can. We've still got thousands of decks to take into account, so there should be a lot of data. And of course, as a reminder, we will go through some of this data quickly and some of it more deeply. The stuff that we skip over, if you want to pay more attention to that, just pause the video, screenshot it, do whatever you need to do. Right, let's dive in. The first thing we'll look at is overall master popularity. So this is a graph showing the overall popularity with the 3 ranked modes, yellow being solos, red being randoms, and blue being pre-mades. And straight away we can see that Ravager is the overall master of choice. Second place Valorian, and Wrecked not very far behind. And then in 4th place we've got Stormbringer. Now Valorian has gone up quite a decent amount this season. His perk 2, the Fervent Warrior, is likely or definitely getting nerfed in the next patch. Very, very strong. We've also seen some more play overall for Mordar and Volko, but Apep's dropped off a decent amount, Wrecked and King Puff as well. But let's just move this data in a slightly different format. We'll have a look at it so we can compare it to last season. So we've got 2 pie charts. On the left, last season. On the right, this season. So last season we could see that Ratbo, Wrecked, Apep were the top 3. This season overall, Ratbo's still there, dropped off a little bit. Valorian has gone up a lot into 2nd place, and Wreck dropped down from 2nd down to 3rd. And as mentioned, Valorian has seen the biggest increase, and Apep the biggest decrease. Well, let's break this down into the different modes. So let's have a look at solos first of all. So solos, last season was Rex number 1, followed by Valorian, and that's the same this season, although those figures have changed a little bit. Rex has dropped and Valorian has increased. Now we can see the average mana cost pretty cheap at the moment in solos. Nice cheap cycle decks. Average mana of 3.1 last season, 3.2 this season. A new player, if you're looking at building a deck, somewhere between 3 and 4.5 is a nice figure, unless you're playing an extreme deck at either of those ends. Now Valorian has gone up the most in solos, as we mentioned, and Wrecked has dropped off the most. So Wrecked, Valorian and Volko, the top 3. And if we're talking about some nerfs coming up in the next patch, Valorian's going to get a nerf, Volko's going to get a nerf, so we're probably going to see more Wrecked, and then Wreck's probably going to get a nerf sometime further in the future. Okay, let's go to 2v2 randoms. And again, looking at the left, we've got Apep, Ratbo, and Wrecked as the top 3. And this season on the right, Ratbo number 1, Morelia number 2, and Apep number 3. Mordar's gone up quite a lot. In fact, the most increase has been for Mordar in randoms. Valorian has also gone up, so has Morelia, and some big decreases. Apep dropping off. As you can see, last season it was number 1. Now it's only number 3. King Puff dropping off as well. Not entirely sure why that is. I've had a lot of success with King Puff. Mana cost more expensive in randoms, as you would probably expect. 3.8, still pretty cheap overall. And then we switch to have a look at pre-mades. So pre-mades, Stormbringer, Ratbo, Apep last season. Stormbringer, Ratbo, Tronvir this season. Tronvir's gone up quite a lot, surprisingly. We see him hardly at all in solos, but we're seeing a lot of Tronvir in pre-mades. And again, Apep, as we've seen before, dropping off quite a bit. And then something a little more different, we have the master popularity in draft. Of course, draft is the mode where you get to choose from 3 masters and then build a deck from 3 options each time. So not quite the same sort of thing compared to ranked when we're looking at the data, but if we have enough data, it should give us something interesting to pull from. And here we can see Valorian still the draft master of choice, Morelia still the second, and Rector's gone up a lot in draft. Rector's gone up 6%. Volko also going up, and as we've seen across the board, Apep dropping off a lot, Ratbo dropped off a lot in draft. Okay, so that's the Masters looked at. Let's have just a very quick look at the rarity compositions of the decks. Just a reminder, there's 4 rarities: common, rare, supreme, and legendary. A lot of people will come to the game thinking it's pay to win, get all the legendaries. As you can see from these graphs, that's clearly not the case. Most decks are made of a combination of commons and rares with some supremes and legendaries, as always. Right, factions. We've got 9 factions in the game, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep. And these are the overall factions based on the cards that are being played from those factions. And we can see Voidborn is still the number 1, but has dropped off quite a lot. Empyrean's gone up into 2nd place, and Scrat dropping down from 2nd to 3rd. And if you're interested to have a look at how that faction composition looks in the different modes, here is a graph for you. Voidborn is still the most played in solos and pre-mades, but not very much in randoms. Why do we think that is? Who knows? Right, wildcards. Wildcards are duplicates when you can use more than 1 copy of a card. And a reminder here, a throwback. No wildcards in solos, no wildcards in pre-mades. They are only in randoms. So we can see the no wildcards has gone up. So more people not playing wildcards, as represented by the green. But more people also playing double wildcards. But what are people playing as those wildcards? So, here we see the top wildcards. Skeleton Crew is the number 1. It was number 2 last season, number 1 this season. And a quick overview of how the colours and stuff work on these graphs. So each of the cards has 2 numbers. The top left number, for example, for Skeleton Crew, the top left number is 1. That's its current rank. The top right number is its rank from last season. So Skeleton Crew is 1st, was 2nd last season. If it's got a green border, that means its rank's gone up from last season. If it's got a red border, its rank's gone down. A white border means it's a new card, and a black border means its rank has not changed. So the top cards being wildcarded. Skeleton Crew, which is kind of interesting because people are wildcarding that even outside of a curse deck. So that might need something. Berserker's got up quite a lot, and that's been quite problematic out there, actually, when people wildcard it, support it. I actually started playing a Milloween deck with the Rockin' Roller in it, specifically to deal with stuff like that, and that was actually working out really well. So Skeleton Crew, Berserker, Arcane Ring, Cleaver, and Stint as the top 5, and as you can see, there's a bunch more cards being wildcarded out there. So Berserker's gone up the most, also Arcane Ring, Protocol Assassin, Dragon Ball, and Arcane Bolt. And I think Arcane Bolt is being played specifically as a counter to things like the Berserker. What's dropped off? Karmic has dropped off a lot. There you can see currently 16th, was 1st. Tantrum Throwers dropping off a lot. Simulacrum, Future Past. And interesting, Skeleton Crew dropping off. Its rate has dropped off, but its position has gone up. So it's being played less, but comparatively it's being played more. If that makes any sense. Okay, so that's the wild cards. Let's have a look at the top cards overall. So again, overall we're talking about all the ranked modes. So if you're new to the game, you're thinking about, oh, what cards do I want to craft? This will give you a great idea of what's currently strong. So we've got super cheap cards at the top there, the Tantrum Throwers, the Skeleton Crew, the Swarmers, the Heel Puff, the Elite Swarmers, Slitherbound. Super cheap cards. The specific thing about those is you can play them directly on a bridge. So they have very strong bridge grabbing power. Karmic was number 1 last season, has dropped down. That's had the biggest decrease. But Karmic's still in the top 7, but not the top one anymore. So a few other cards that have dropped off. Defenso Chopper's dropped off quite a lot. Illusory Dragon Whelp, Mana Puff, and Bats. Some of those cards getting nerfed in the last patch, giving us an idea of perhaps why those cards have dropped off. But what's gone up? Daggerfall's gone up. There you can see it's number 3, was number 14. So Daggerfall's gone up quite a lot. I did propose a nerf to the Daggerfall. I think it does too much. I think the area is too big. I'm not sure if that went through or not. Berserker has also gone up quite a lot. And Magma Cannon as well. So those are the top cards overall. But let's break it down a little bit and have a look at the different types of cards in the different modes. So here we're going to look at the top cards, but we're going to do it. We're going to look at the non-spells and then the spells, because generally if you're building a deck, you're thinking about what spells do I want, what minions do I want. So it kind of makes sense to separate those things out. So we've got solos, randoms, and pre-mates here. And you can see that some of these cards are going to be appropriate in all of the game modes. We know some cards are going to be better in 2v2 when you're talking about doing sort of like, for example, the Curse Bearer doing this curse damage to big units, to lots of units. Whereas things like the Tantrum Throwers, the Skeleton Crew, these cards are great in any mode. Cheap bridge grabs, grab on a bridge even if you're walking backwards. So anything interesting here to point out? Heal Puff. Is the Heal Puff getting a nerf? I feel like the Heal Puff did get a nerf. And remember, recently they did change the puffs so that you can play them directly wherever you want now. And that seems to have made puffs a lot stronger, and consequently they have been nerfed. And the Heal Puff did get nerfed. Its healing going down to 12 health per second, I think, instead of 15 in the last patch. So those are the top non-cards overall. Sorry, not non-cards, non-spells. And then if we have a look at the top spells, so in solos, Daggerfall is still number 1. Frostfeather Flyby going up a little bit. Unholy Ground going up a decent amount. But we can see Daggerfall valuable in all of the game modes. And interestingly, Beam of Doom, heavy removal spell, again in all of the game modes. So a lot of these cards being used not only in 1v1 but in 2v2, and Mountain Shaper making a little bit of a resurgence. And one of the cool things about Mountain Shaper, I don't know if it was intended or not, but you can do quite a lot of face damage with it, and that might be something that needs to be considered. But remember, Mountain Shaper only does one lane as opposed to what it used to do, but it goes all the way back to the Master. So once it's fully charged, if you use it appropriately, you can get a huge amount of value out of that. Solos, as we've seen a bit of a resurgence for Arcane Barrage. As we mentioned, Frostfeather Flyby going up a bit. Hypnotize as well. Bats dropped off hugely in solos, and probably overall. It did get nerfed in the last patch. And of course, there was also the change to the Wrecked ult perk, the Mass Illusion, where you can't use that on air units. And that was one of the most popular Bats decks. And I think the Nether Bats themselves also got a nerf. So quite a lot of nerfs coming together to really remove that play rate of the Bats. Solos, randoms, Arcane Bolt, number 1 was number 20. That's had the biggest increase in play rate by a long way of all the spells in all of the game modes. And again, I think that is specifically to counter things like the Berserker. But there's lots of great targets for that. Berserker, Coax, Zip Zapinator, all those kind of things. And remember, it did get a balance change a little while ago. So if you don't destroy it, you don't pay the full amount. It's 3 mana plus an extra 2 mana freeze if the thing destroys. So a good spell and lots of good targets for it. But remember, target it properly. It will target whatever has the highest HP within that area. So you've got to be careful with it. You can definitely mess that up. Okay, so if you're looking to put some spells in your deck, this is a great choice of them. Now, Legendaries. We spoke about earlier that the Legendaries are not the be-all and end-all. They aren't necessarily... You're not going to build a deck of just all Legendaries and dominate, okay? Most decks have 1 or 2 Legendaries in. Some of them are very sort of flexible, like Karmic, it can go in any other deck. Others are very specific, and you want to put them in a specific kind of deck. For example, Gax, you know, you want to play that in a specific sort of aggro deck. So if you're thinking about buying, crafting some legendaries, these will give you a good idea of where to go. And we can see in solos, Karmic is still number 1. Prime Sergeant Radic is still number 2. Denver has gone up quite a lot if we look overall. Not in the top 9, but some decent play rate for Denver. And that's specifically, we've seen a lot of Volco decks with Denver in there. Now, Karmic is the number 1 in solos, legendary-wise, but its play rate has dropped quite a lot overall as we look at all the legendaries. So, number 1, but not as much of a number 1, if that kind of makes sense. Now, again, in randoms, we see a bit of a resurgence again for that Mountain Shaper. Was the 26th overall, now is 3rd. You're not going to see that in solos, but in 2v2s, it's been getting a lot of value. And I think it's been buffed quite a few times, and people have been sleeping on it a little bit. Because people were sleeping on it, the buffs kind of went unnoticed. Then it got more buffs, still didn't get played, and now it's in a position where it's actually pretty damn strong. Right, so those are the legendaries overall in the 3 separate modes. And if we put that data together, Karmic is the number 1 legendary played by a long way. Over double the play rate of the 2nd legendary, which is Razor Squadron. Valstalker in 3rd. Jackia won't understand that. Fergus Flagoon Fighter and Bara is the top 5. Right. So that's a bit of a look at the ranked modes. Let's just have a quick look at the draft. Now again, draft is a little bit different because of the way that you can't just directly choose what you want, but there's some stuff in there that we see a lot. Bounceberry Flingers, Crystal Sentry, Prowler, Brothers of Light, Berserker still in there, Whirly Scrap, Blue Golem, Defenso Chopper, so a lot of things in there that make definite sense, and you can fit in pretty much any deck. Netherbats we can see there dropping off, as we mentioned before, having that nerf. The biggest increases, Crystal Sentry, we've seen a lot more of him in draft this season, as with the Brothers of Light, the Bounceberry Flingers, and so on and so forth. War Dancers have dropped off, Karmic also dropping off. But if you're looking at building draft decks, these are going to definitely be some good picks to include in there. And then, of course, the other side of draft is the spells. And things like the Frostfeather Flyby, the Last Stand, Wheel of Doom, some definitely very powerful spells that you can grab there. Wheel of Doom's gone up quite a lot, as has Frostfeather Flyby. Infiltration falling off in draft for some reason, Impetus Blast as well, and Bats, as we kind of discussed previously. Draft is a little bit different because of the random nature of it. You don't necessarily get to choose exactly what you want, so a lot of it is like just grabbing what you can. But any of these top spells are definitely going to be good, although they're of course going to hold a very different position depending on which ones you go for. Right, so we've looked at the Masters, we've looked at the cards. Let's bring this together and look at the decks. So what we're going to do with the decks is I'm going to kind of order the decks based on, firstly, the position of them when they were on the leaderboard, and also the average rank of the cards within them. So we're looking at high leaderboard place decks with cards of a high average rank. And we're also going to look at one deck for each master in all of the modes. So there will be a lot to go through, but of course, if you want to pause the video, screenshot it, whatever you need to do, do it. So top 1v1 decks. The top deck here we're seeing is the Valorian deck. Lots of cheap cycle cards, bridge grabs. We see the Daggerfall. We saw how powerful that spell is. Legionnaires likely to get a change in the next patch, as with Magma Cannon. And Blue Golem being the spearhead of that deck. Of course, it has the Bounceberry Flingers to give you the Shroom for the Blue Golem. Next up, we have Volco. And one thing we can't tell from the leaderboards is what perks they're using, but we can make an an educated guess based on our experience and the look of the deck. And I did make a video recently about win rates of different perks, so go check that out after this if you haven't seen that. But this Volko will likely be using the alt perk 3 to get that extra mana. So lots of very powerful cards there. Third up we have Wrecked. Then we have an APEP deck and a future Ratbow. Interesting Mordor deck, not a heavy Mordor deck. There's definitely some kind of bad reses in there in terms of the heal. The heal puff image is actually wrong there for some reason. But yeah, the heal puff won't be a bad res since, of course, it doesn't get resed. Hit puffs and illusions don't res. So interesting there, and we're seeing Berserker getting some play. Next up, we see a very aggro Morelia deck. Setsu not getting too much love, but a cheap cycle Setsu deck. Kurnath Crystal back there to get the extra synergy from Setsu. And there we see a powerful Ravager deck. We've got Denver the Last King. He's had some buffs recently. He's pretty damn strong. So we see a push there with some spirits. And then we see probably a Disu Milloween from the looks of it. Most people would probably struggle to play this, but it looks like a fun deck, and there's definitely some cool things you can do in there, especially with the Impetus Blast. Right, closing out the solo decks, we have Diona in there, we have Stormbringer, King Puff, and coming up the rear, Tronvir, who's seen almost no play in solos. Okay, let's switch to randoms. The top 2v2 random decks. Now, in randoms, there may be wildcards. If you see the little tab, for example, against the Stint and the Skeleton Crew in Ratbow, that means that they're wildcarded. So, Ratbow is the #1 deck based on this criteria in randoms. And then we got Valorian, Morelia, Stormbringer with some ranged units in there, a future APEP deck, Volko, Wrecked, Ravager, Milloween. Tronvir sees more play in 2v2s, considerably more compared to solos. And then we see a Mordor deck that has the Shrooms, Healing, Shroom, Spirit, Rampage, Stormy, Pokes. That's the kind of thing that I really like Rock'n'Roller against. Big push, Rock'n'Roller slams it down. Right, and then closing this out, we have Diona, King Puff, pretty low there. And just to point out, the order of the Masters is the order that we find them in based on the criteria that we kind of sorted everything by. So I think that's my King Puff deck that I've played quite a lot. And then Setsu coming up the rear. Right, moving on to some pre-made decks. Now, one thing to mention about the pre-made decks is some of these decks will work specifically with other decks that they're designed. You know, there might be two people that only play together and they made their decks perfectly to work together, whereas other people might have different partners. Bit of swinging out there. Okay, so the top pre-made deck is showing as Volko. And then we have APEP, Ratbow, Milloween, and then we've got King Puff in there. Stormbringer, so we've got Elfbringer there, really. Tronvir, we've got a Ritual of Servitude Mordor, Morelia, but not an Accursed Morelia. Valorian as well. And then closing out this section, we have Wrecked, Diona, Ravager, and a Setsu deck. Right, so I think the rest of the sections that we're going to go through are the sections we're just going to skim through really quickly. So if you want to pay more attention to those, make sure you pause the video, screenshot it, whatever you want to do, because there's going to be a lot of stuff there that's kind of just going over what we've seen already, but just drilling down a little bit, and we don't necessarily want to make the video too long. Right, so these are the top cards overall for solos, top non-spell cards for solos, and the top spells for solos. So we've had a look at this data a little bit when we had a look at the 3 modes together, but this gives you a top 27 instead of a top 9 for each of these. So more data, more good. And then closing out the solo section, we have the top legendaries in 1v1. And again, we'll do the same for randoms. So we have the top cards in randoms, the top non-spell cards in randoms, top spells, and top legendaries. And then again, pre-mades, overall top cards non-spells, top card spells, and top pre-made legendaries. Okay, and then the next section, we're going to have a look at the cards popularity per mode, per master. So if there's a specific master you're interested in, this section's going to be perfect for you. And again, just pause and screenshot as you need to. So first of all, we're going to look at APEP. So top APEP cards in 1v1, top APEP cards in randoms, and top APEP cards in pre-mades. And again, we'll keep going through the masters. So Diona 1v1, Diona randoms, Diona pre-mades. And one thing to mention is look at the number of decks at the bottom. That tells you how many decks this data is from. A lot of decks means that it's being played a lot and there's a lot of data to grab this information from. Only a few decks means it's not going to be so much data and only based on a few decks. Right, King Puff solos, King Puff randoms, and King Puff pre-mades. Milloween in solos, Milloween in randoms, Milloween in pre-mades, Mordor in solos, Mordor in randoms, Mordor in pre-mades, Morelia in solos, Morelia in randoms, Morelia in pre-mades. And here we have Rect in solos, randoms, and pre-mades. Solo Ratbo, randoms Ratbo, and pre-mades Ratbo. Ravager in solos, Ravager in randoms, Ravager in pre-mades. Setsu solos, Setsu randoms, Setsu pre-mades. Stormbringer in solos, Stormbringer in randoms, Stormbringer in pre-mades. Interesting one here, Tromvir in solos, and there was only one deck, hence most of the data is empty. Now Tromvir in randoms, more decks here, and Tromvir in pre-mades. Valorian in solos, in randoms, and pre-mades. And closing out the Masters, Volko in solos, Volko in randoms, and Volko in pre-mades. There we go. Guys, we did it. Thanks for joining me for this. We went through a lot of data. If you need to revisit it, please do so. Take your time to pause the video, to screenshot it, to look at it, whatever you need to do. Hopefully this should be interesting information and useful for players, whether you're new or old. As I mentioned at the start, a lot of time and effort does go into these videos, so it really does help if you hit that subscribe button if you're new here, or if you're just not subscribed yet. Join us for the Minion Masters experience. A lot of stuff to go through. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments, what did you think about the format that we do here? And also, what do you think about the data that we showed? Is there stuff that you're surprised about? Because remember, we're looking at leaderboard data, which might not be the same as people playing at a slightly lower level. And as I alluded to before, we did have a look at some data provided by the developers regarding win rates and play rates. So check out that video maybe after this one to find out more about that. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover today. My name is Bad as a Fish, and I'll see you again soon here in the fish tank.